Elena Morales had lived most of her 56 years in Oak Cliff, a working-class neighborhood just south of downtown Dallas. Her small apartment sat above the laundromat she ran, a place that smelled of detergent and steam, a place where the rhythm of spinning machines kept her company through long evenings. For decades, she had carried baskets of clothes heavier than her own body weight. For decades, she had sewn torn shirts, patched jeans, and pressed uniforms until her hands grew stiff. She never complained. Every dollar she earned went toward raising her only daughter, Clara. Now Clara was 28 and about to marry into a family that belonged to a different world. Elena could hardly believe it. She told her customers with pride, "My daughter is marrying in the Reed family at a hotel in downtown Dallas." She described the chandeliers she had only seen in magazines, the ballroom that could fit hundreds. In her heart, Eleanor felt she had finally reached a reward for all those years of sacrifice. On Sundays, when she walked to the Baptist church nearby, neighbors stopped her to ask about the wedding. Elena's face lit up. "It will be the most beautiful day," she said. She pictured herself in the front row, watching Clara walk down the aisle in white. She imagined the music swelling, the pastor's voice echoing through the hall, and her own tears of joy sliding down her cheeks. But dreams often meet resistance in reality. And in Dallas, where appearances carried weight heavier than truth, a mother's love was not always enough to guarantee a place of honor. Something subtle was already shifting. Elena would soon discover that the seat she imagined for herself was not the one others had in mind. Would she still find joy in that moment, or would the celebration she longed for turn into something else entirely? The answer was closer than she realized. Elena's life had never been easy, yet she carried it with quiet dignity. When Clara was a little girl, Elena often worked 2 jobs. By day, she managed the laundromat, hauling wet bundles from washer to dryer, her arms sore from endless repetition. By night, she sat at an old Singer sewing machine in the corner of their apartment, fixing hems, stitching zippers, and taking in dresses for neighbors who could not afford new ones. Clara remembered falling asleep to the sound of that machine, its steady clatter almost like a lullaby. Sometimes Eleanor would pause to rub her aching wrists, then whisper to herself, "One more dress, just one more." Every stitch was a step toward Clara's future. Tuition, books, even school trips. Elena paid for it all. She skipped dinners so Clara never missed lunch at school. She walked instead of taking the bus so Clara could have new shoes. There were winters when the heating bill came late, but Clara's notebooks were always bought on time. There were birthdays without cakes, but never without love. Elena's sacrifices built a bridge that carried Clara far from Oak Cliff's narrow streets into the promise of college, internships, and now a future marriage in a world Elena had only glimpsed from afar. Looking back, the laundromat's fluorescent lights and the hum of dryers seemed ordinary. Yet within those walls, a destiny had been forged. Eleanor had given Clara the wings she never had. The question remained, would Clara remember who built those wings when it mattered most? Something in the air suggested that memory might fade when faced with the glitter of downtown Dallas. For most of Clara's childhood, her bond with Elena was unbreakable. They were more than mother and daughter. They were teammates against the weight of the world. Clara would sit on the laundromat counter with a book while Elena folded clothes, and they would laugh about silly customers or dream about the future together. Elena always said, "You'll go further than I ever did." And Clara believed her. But things began to shift the moment Clara left Oak Cliff to attend the University of Texas at Austin. At first, she called her mother every night, sharing stories of classes and friends. Slowly, the calls turned into once a week, then once a month. She started correcting Elena's English, sometimes with a sharpness that stung. When Elena visited the campus once, carrying homemade food, Clara looked embarrassed as her sorority sisters passed by. It was subtle, but the distance widened. By the time Clara graduated with honors in law, she spoke more like her professors than the girl who once sat on the laundromat counter. She dressed in suits, shook hands firmly, and moved in circles Elena barely understood. Elena was proud, but there were cracks she could not ignore. Conversations about the wedding revealed them more clearly. Clara wanted everything perfect, polished and grand. Elena wanted warmth and family. Still, Elena believed love could heal those fissures. She reminded herself that every generation dreams differently. Yet beneath that hope lingered a question too heavy to shake. Had Clara's new world left her old one, and her mother, behind? The wedding would soon reveal the answer in ways Elena never expected. It was a Sunday afternoon when Clara visited Elena at the laundromat. She wore a tailored blazer and heels that clicked against the tiled floor, a sound that didn't belong in that space of detergent and hum. With a bright smile, Clara spread a glossy brochure across the counter. On the cover was a ballroom glittering with chandeliers. "Mom, this is it," Clara said, pointing. "The Magnolia Grand Hotel, right in the heart of downtown Dallas. Can you imagine? 600 guests, live orchestra, a 5-course dinner. It's going to be the wedding of the year." Elena traced the picture of the ballroom with her fingers, almost afraid to touch it. She had seen places like that only in magazines. "It's beautiful," she whispered, though her voice trembled. Clara kept talking, excitement spilling out. She described the flower arrangements: white roses imported from California, the marble floors, and the rooftop view of the city skyline. She spoke of photographers, videographers, and designer gowns. Every detail felt like a production staged for royalty. Elena smiled, trying to keep up, but her heart sank. She wondered where she would fit in this grand performance. She imagined herself in her simple dress, surrounded by guests in gowns worth more than her monthly income. But Clara didn't pause to notice. "This is my dream, Mom," Clara said firmly. "Everything has to be perfect." Elena nodded, forcing a smile, yet inside she felt a quiet unease. Dreams this big often left little space for the people who made them possible. And she could not shake the thought, in all this glitter, would there still be a place for her? That night, after Clara left, Elena sat alone in her small apartment above the laundromat. The brochure of the Magnolia Grand Hotel lay open on her kitchen table. She gazed at the photographs until her eyes blurred, picturing herself there. In her mind, she was seated in the very front row, her daughter walking down the aisle under the glow of chandeliers. Elena imagined the hush of the crowd as the music began. She could see Clara's veil trailing behind her like a cloud, and she could almost hear the pastor's voice blessing the union. In that dream, Elena dabbed her eyes with a tissue, overwhelmed with joy. Every sacrifice, the missed meals, the sleepless nights at the sewing machine, culminated in that moment. She pictured herself turning to the guests, whispering proudly, "That's my daughter, the lawyer, the bride." Oh, the thought filled her with warmth that softened the fatigue of her body. For Eleanor, the wedding wasn't about chandeliers or marble floors. It was about validation, proof that her love and labor had not been in vain. She even practiced what she might say, if given the chance to speak. "Clara, you are my dream come true. I prayed for this day since the first time I held you in my arms." Elena closed her eyes with a smile, believing that a front-row seat was the natural place for a mother. But dreams, as beautiful as they are, can collide with expectations. The path she imagined was about to twist, and she had no idea how painful the detour would be. A week later, Clara invited her mother to lunch at a cafe near uptown Dallas. The place was polished, with white marble tables and soft jazz humming in the background. Elena felt out of place in her plain cardigan, while Clara blended perfectly among the sleek young professionals around them. Between bites of salad, Clara leaned forward and lowered her voice. "Mum, I need to talk to you about something important. The Reeds are very particular about etiquette. They want everything to reflect well on the family." Elena smiled, unsure. "Of course, Mija. I'll be polite." Clara hesitated, then added, "It's more than politeness. They're expecting a certain presentation. Things like the way we dress, how we speak, even where people sit. This wedding isn't just about us, it's about their reputation." Elena set down her fork, her heart tightening. "Are you worried about me embarrassing you?" Clara shifted uncomfortably. "No, it's not that. It's just, you know how sometimes you get nervous and slip into Spanish. Jonathan's family might not understand. And your dress, it should be elegant, something that fits the venue." For a moment, Elena felt as though the cafe walls closed in around her. She had worked so hard for this daughter, yet here she was, being gently pushed aside in the name of appearances. She forced a nod. "I'll do my best." Clara smiled quickly, relieved. But as Elena stirred her coffee, one thought echoed in her mind. When did love become a matter of etiquette? And what else would her daughter ask her to change before the big day? Jonathan Reed came from a very different side of Dallas. His family lived in Highland Park, a neighborhood of tree-lined streets, sprawling homes, and manicured lawns that seemed worlds away from Eleanor's laundromat in Oak Cliff. His father, Richard Reed, was a retired oil executive. His mother, Margaret, served on boards for charities and attended galas that filled society pages in the Dallas Morning News. Jonathan himself worked as a financial consultant downtown. He was tall, confident, and always well-dressed. Clara had met him at a networking event during her final year of law school. To Elena, he seemed polite enough, though distant. His smile was warm but measured, the kind of smile that belonged to someone raised to perform in public. When Jonathan first visited the laundromat to meet Elena, he shook her hand firmly and said, "It's an honor to meet you, Mrs. Morales." Elena had been impressed by his manners, but she noticed how quickly he glanced around the small shop, almost uncomfortable with the worn floor and the hum of machines. At family dinners in Highland Park, Elena sensed the unspoken divide. The Reeds sipped fine wine and discussed investments, vacations in Europe, and exclusive golf clubs. Elena listened quietly, her hands folded in her lap. No one was rude, but she felt like an observer in a world that wasn't hers. Still, she reminded herself that Jonathan made Clara happy. And wasn't that what mattered? Elena chose to believe that love could bridge different worlds, but beneath her hope lingered a quiet question. Would the Reeds ever truly see her as part of theirs? The first time Elena truly understood Margaret Reed's view of her came during a dinner at the Reeds' home in Highland Park. Their dining room was lit by a crystal chandelier, the table stretched long enough to seat a dozen, and the silverware shone like it had never been touched. Elena sat nervously at the far end, her hands resting on the linen napkin folded neatly in her lap. Margaret, poised in a navy dress and pearls, poured herself another glass of Chardonnay before turning her gaze toward Elena. With a smile too polished to be sincere, she said, "Clara tells us you run a laundromat. That must keep you very busy." Elena nodded. "Yes, it does. It's hard work, but it's honest work." Margaret tilted her head, her eyes sharp behind the smile. "Of course. Still, I imagine it must be different, preparing for an event like this wedding. The people who will attend are used to a certain standard." She let the words hang in the air, sipping her wine slowly. Jonathan shifted uncomfortably in his seat but said nothing. Clara reached for her glass, avoiding her mother's eyes. Elena felt the sting beneath Margaret's words. She wasn't outright insulted, but the message was clear. In Margaret's world, appearances were currency, and Elena had none to spend. She forced a small smile. "I may not have much, but I'll be there for my daughter. That's what matters to me." Margaret gave a polite nod, her eyes already moving elsewhere. But in that moment, Elena realized something important. The battle for dignity at Clara's wedding had already begun, and Margaret Reed intended to win. A few days after that dinner in Highland Park, Elena decided she needed to find something special to wear. She took the city bus to a discount department store on Jefferson Boulevard, not far from her laundromat. The mannequins in the window wore bright summer dresses, and clearance tags dangled from every sleeve. Elena walked slowly through the racks, her fingers brushing fabric she could afford. She paused in front of a soft, navy blue dress. It wasn't designer. It didn't sparkle under the fluorescent lights, but it was simple, graceful and modest. She held it up to her body in the mirror, tilting her head. For a moment, she could almost see herself standing in that grand hotel ballroom, her chin lifted with quiet pride. A sales clerk approached. "It looks lovely on you," she said with a friendly smile. Elena's eyes warmed. She hadn't heard a compliment about her appearance in a long time. At the checkout counter, Elena counted out bills carefully, making sure not to overspend. The dress went into a thin plastic bag, and she carried it home as if it were made of silk. That night, she hung it neatly on the back of her bedroom door and sat on the bed to look at it. She imagined Clara seeing her in it, perhaps saying, "You look beautiful, Mum." That hope alone filled her chest with light. But as Elena drifted to sleep, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered, would her daughter notice the love stitched into that dress, or only the price tag it lacked? One evening, Clara stopped by the laundromat after work. She wore a sleek grey suit, her hair tied neatly in a bun, looking every bit the young attorney she had become. Elena, still in her apron, wiped her hands on a towel and offered her daughter a smile. Clara's eyes landed on the navy blue dress hanging by the counter. "Is that what you're planning to wear for the wedding, Mom?" Elena nodded proudly. "I found it on sale. Simple, but I think it's nice." Clara hesitated. "It's fine, Mom, really, but I just want you to remember this wedding is going to be very formal. There will be a lot of important people there. I need everything to be perfect." Elena tilted her head. "Are you worried about me, Mija?" Clara forced a smile. "Not worried exactly. Just maybe keep things simple. Don't feel like you have to mingle too much. The Reeds have so many guests coming from out of town, and I don't want you to feel uncomfortable." The words settled like a stone in Elena's chest. She nodded slowly, hiding her hurt. "I'll stay where you want me to, Clara." Clara kissed her cheek quickly and walked out, leaving the scent of her perfume behind. Eleanor stood alone in the hum of the machines, staring at the dress. For the first time, she wondered if her daughter didn't see her as a source of pride, but as something to manage. And deep inside, she sensed the truth. The wedding she had dreamed of might not hold the place she imagined for herself. A week later, Clara invited both families to a planning meeting at the Magnolia Grand Hotel. The ballroom smelled faintly of fresh polish and lilies, and a long table was covered with swatches of fabric, sample menus, and flower catalogues. Elena sat quietly at the end, her hands folded in her lap, while voices around her filled the room with excitement. Margaret Reed spoke with authority, flipping through the menu options. "The sea base with lemon beurre blanc is far more suitable than chicken. We must choose something refined." Richard Reed nodded in agreement, and Jonathan added comments about the wine pairings. Clara scribbled notes, her pen moving quickly. Elena waited for her daughter's eyes to meet hers. She thought Clara might ask what flowers she liked, or whether the playlist should include a Spanish song they both loved. But Clara never looked her way. Not once. When the topic turned to seating charts, Elena leaned forward, ready to mention a few relatives from San Antonio who might attend. Before she could speak, Margaret smoothly redirected the conversation. "We'll place the Reed family near the front, of course. The Morales relatives, well, perhaps toward the back where it's quieter." Laughter rippled gently around the table. Elena sank back in her chair. She realized she was not part of the planning, she was merely an observer. In that glittering ballroom, with chandeliers overhead and polished floors beneath her feet, Elena felt smaller than ever. She wondered, not for the last time, if her presence at this wedding was more burden than blessing. The truth was beginning to show, even before the big day arrived. As the meeting continued, the hotel's event coordinator brought up the order of the reception. "After dinner, we'll have the toasts. Traditionally, parents of the bride and groom may say a few words." Elena's heart lifted. She had imagined this moment countless times, standing in front of the guests, speaking from her soul about the journey she and Clara had shared. She didn't have fancy words, but she had truth. Before she could say anything, Margaret Reed's voice cut smoothly across the table. "Oh, perhaps it's best to keep the speeches brief. Jonathan and Clara can handle most of it. Too many people speaking can slow the evening down." Clara glanced at her mother, then back at Margaret. She didn't object. Jonathan shifted uncomfortably, adjusting his cufflinks. Elena lowered her eyes to her hands. Margaret hadn't said her name directly, but the message was clear. There was no place for her voice in this celebration. Margaret smiled politely and continued. "It's important that the evening feels polished. Guests will expect a certain flow. The focus should remain on the couple." Eleanor forced a smile, though her throat ached. She whispered softly, "Of course. The focus should be on them." Inside, however, a wave of sadness rose. She wondered how a wedding, the union of families, could feel so much like erasure. For Elena, silence had always been a survival skill, but this silence cut deeper. It wasn't about keeping peace, it was about being made invisible, and invisibility, she knew, could hurt more than any spoken insult. A few days after the planning meeting, Clara stopped by the laundromat late in the evening. The machines rattled in the background, and the smell of detergent lingered in the air. Eleanor was folding towels when Clara leaned against the counter, her face tense. "Mom," Clara began carefully, "I need to talk to you about something delicate." Elena looked up, concerned. "Of course, Mika, what is it?" Clara took a breath. "At the wedding, it would mean a lot if you kept everything in English. No Spanish, please. I don't want people feeling out of place, especially Jonathan's relatives." Elena froze, a towel clenched in her hands. "You mean I can't even say a few words in my own language?" Clara winced. "It's not about you. It's just people can be judgmental. I don't want anyone whispering or thinking less of us. This night has to be perfect." Elena's chest tightened. She had sung lullabies to Clara in Spanish, whispered prayers over her in Spanish, even taught her first words that way. Now those words were seen as shameful. "I understand," Elena said softly, though her throat burned. "I'll keep quiet." Clara reached out, touching her arm. "Don't take it personally, Mum. It's just etiquette." Elena nodded, forcing a smile, but inside, a storm was building. She wondered how love could be measured in languages, and whether her daughter realized what she was truly asking her to bury. For the first time, Eleanor felt a shadow of doubt about where she belonged on that perfect night, and the shadow was only growing. The following weekend, Elena was invited to dinner at the Reeds' home again. The table gleamed under soft candlelight, and the smell of rosemary lamb filled the air. Margaret moved gracefully through the conversation, steering topics toward travel, investments, and social events. Elena sat quietly, answering when asked, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. At one point, Jonathan noticed Elena's unease. He leaned slightly toward her and said with a gentle smile, "Mrs. Morales, I know these dinners can feel formal. Please don't worry. You don't have to change who you are." Elena's eyes softened. "Thank you, Jonathan. That means a lot." But before the warmth could settle, Margaret spoke without looking up from her plate. "Of course, we all want to be ourselves. But sometimes in society, it's about representing the family with the right presentation." Jonathan hesitated, then chuckled lightly as if to ease the tension. "My mother only means well. She just wants everything to go smoothly." Elena glanced at him, searching for a stronger defense. None came. Jonathan's tone was kind, but his silence toward Margaret's barbs was louder than any words. "Clara deserves a perfect wedding," Jonathan added, raising his glass. Eleanor nodded slowly, lifting her water glass in response. She wondered if he realized how much perfection was costing her. Jonathan's smile lingered, but his eyes slid away. In that moment, Elena understood. He was polite, he was gentle, but he would never stand between her and Margaret. Whatever battles lay ahead, she would face them alone. 2 weeks before the wedding, Clara invited Elena to the hotel once more. The event coordinator spread a giant seating chart across the ballroom table. Each round table was marked with names written in neat cursive on small cards. Margaret leaned over the chart, pointing with a manicured finger. "The Reed family will naturally take the front tables, closest to the stage. Our friends from Houston and Austin should also be up front. Then Jonathan's colleagues, the partners from his firm." Clara scribbled notes, nodding eagerly. Eleanor leaned closer, searching for her name. At last, she spotted it. Her heart sank. Table 27. It sat at the very back of the diagram, tucked against the wall near the service entrance. The kitchen doors opened just a few feet away. Eleanor swallowed hard. "Table 27?" she asked softly. Clara glanced quickly, her cheeks flushing. "Mum, it's just logistics. We had to make space for important guests up front. You'll still have a seat." Margaret added smoothly, "It's actually quieter back there, less overwhelming." Elena's lips parted, but no words came. A mother's place, she thought, should never be by the kitchen doors. She pictured herself craning her neck from the farthest corner, struggling to see her only daughter's vows. She forced a smile. "Of course, I understand." But inside, her heart cracked. She realized she wasn't simply being pushed aside, she was being hidden. And as the women finalized their elegant arrangements, Elena sat in silence, wondering how a celebration of love could feel so much like exile. When Elena returned home that night, she placed her keys on the kitchen counter and sank into the worn armchair by the window. From the street below, the sounds of Oak Cliff drifted in, cars passing, neighbors talking, children playing. Life felt ordinary, steady, but inside her chest, something weighed heavy. She replayed the seating chart in her mind. Table 27, near the kitchen doors. She imagined the clatter of trays, the rush of servers brushing past, the smell of food instead of the sight of her daughter walking down the aisle. For a moment, anger flared, but it quickly softened into sorrow. When her neighbor, Mrs. Lopez, stopped by with a bag of tamales, Elena forced a cheerful smile. "Everything is fine. The wedding will be beautiful." She spoke brightly, hiding the truth. Later, alone, Elena hung the navy blue dress in front of her mirror and studied it. "You'll do," she whispered, as if reassuring herself. She practiced smiling, holding her chin high. If she could not sit in the front, she would at least sit with dignity. But in the quiet of her room, the mask slipped. Tears stung her eyes, though she wiped them away quickly. She had never wanted luxury or recognition, only the honor of being close to her daughter on the most important day of her life. Elena folded her hands and whispered a short prayer. "Give me strength to endure, Lord." She promised herself she would not complain again. Outwardly, she would be calm, supportive, invisible if that was what they wanted. But inside, the wound deepened, and it would not heal so easily. A few days later, Elena was back at the laundromat folding a pile of freshly dried shirts. The bell above the door jingled, and in walked Sam Carter, Clara's childhood friend. Sam still lived in Dallas, working as a school counselor. Her smile was warm, her voice steady, and she had always treated Elena with respect. "Señora Morales," Sam greeted, slipping into Spanish with ease. "I heard you've been busy with all the wedding plans." Elena smiled faintly. "Busy, yes, but not in the way you'd think." Sam tilted her head. "What do you mean?" Elena hesitated, then sighed. "They've placed me at the last table, near the kitchen." Sam's eyes widened. "What? You're the bride's mother. That doesn't make sense." Elena shrugged, folding another shirt with careful precision. "It's fine. They say it will be quieter there." Sam crossed her arms, her voice firm. "That's not fine. You raised Clara on your own. You sacrificed everything for her. You belong in the front, not hidden away." Elena shook her head gently. "I don't want to cause problems. It's her day, not mine." Sam leaned closer, lowering her voice. "It is her day, but it's also yours. Without you, this wedding wouldn't even exist." For the first time in days, Elena felt seen. A small smile tugged at her lips, though her eyes were still heavy with sadness. Sam patted her hand. "Don't worry, Señora Morales. People will know the truth, one way or another." Elena looked at her friend, uncertain. But deep inside, a spark of hope flickered to life. Sam's words hinted that silence might not last forever. The following Saturday, Clara invited Eleanor to join her and Margaret at a boutique in North Park Center. The store was gleaming, filled with crystal chandeliers and rows of gowns priced higher than Eleanor's monthly rent. Elena walked slowly, her fingers brushing fabric she had only ever seen in magazines. Clara tried on dress after dress, each one shimmering with lace, silk, or beaded detail. Elena offered quiet suggestions. "This one, Misha, it has elegance, but also warmth. It reminds me of you." Before Clara could respond, Margaret's voice sliced in. No, that fabric is far too plain. A reed wedding deserves something couture." She turned to the consultant. "Bring us the Vera Wang collection." Moments later, a gown worth several thousands was carried in. Clara slipped into it, and Margaret clasped her hands with delight. "Now this," she said, "is worthy of the Reed name." Elena watched, her smile fading. The price tag alone made her stomach twist. She whispered softly, "It's beautiful, but maybe too extravagant." Margaret didn't look at her. "Excessive is exactly what this wedding requires. Simplicity has its place, but not here." Clara twirled in the mirror, uncertainty flickering across her face. Elena saw it, but the moment passed as Margaret showered her with compliments. Clara nodded, agreeing to the purchase. As the consultant rang up the dress, Elena stepped back, clutching her worn purse. She felt invisible in the glittering boutique. Her opinion, once the only one Clara had cared for, was now dismissed like outdated fabric. Walking out of the store, Elena whispered to herself, "A mother's advice should never be silenced by a price tag." Yet that was exactly what had just happened. That evening, Clara stopped by the laundromat, the expensive gown now hidden away at the boutique for final fittings. Elena was folding clothes, the smell of starch heavy in the air. She tried to start lightly. "Mija, that dress is beautiful, but it cost more than I made in 6 months. Are you sure it's necessary?" Clara stiffened. "Mom, it's my wedding. It's supposed to be the most important day of my life. Why can't you just be happy for me?" Elena swallowed hard. "I am happy, Clara. You know that. But sometimes I wonder if you remember what it took to get you here. I sacrificed so much. I worked nights, skipped meals, walked miles, just so you could have a future." Clara's voice rose. "And I've worked too, Mom. I studied. I fought to build a career. I earned this life. It's not just your sacrifices that got me here. I carried my own weight." The words struck Eleanor like a slap. She stared at her daughter, stunned. "I never said you didn't. But without me, without the years I gave, would you even have had the chance?" Clara crossed her arms, her jaw tight. "I'm grateful, Mom. I am. But sometimes it feels like you want to take credit for everything I've done." Eleanor's chest ached. She whispered, "I only wanted to share in your joy, Clara, not be erased from it." The silence between them stretched, heavy and sharp. Clara turned toward the door, her heels clicking against the tile. "This is my day, Mom. Please don't make it harder than it needs to be." The door shut, leaving Elena in the hum of the dryers, wondering when love had turned into competition. The next Sunday, the families gathered once more at the Reed residence. The living room glowed with soft lamplight, filled with the quiet clink of crystal glasses and the murmur of polite conversation. Eleanor sat on the edge of a chair, her navy cardigan pulled close, trying to fade into the background. Margaret was speaking with a group of relatives from Houston when her words carried across the room. "Weddings are delicate affairs. You have to make sure the guest list and the seating reflect the right balance. After all, not everyone belongs at the same social level." The room chuckled politely. Clara lowered her eyes, pretending not to hear. Jonathan shifted his weight, but said nothing. Elena felt the words pierce her like a needle. She understood the message. Margaret hadn't named her, but she didn't need to. The implication was clear. Elena was not on their level, and her presence at the wedding would always feel like a flaw in the otherwise polished image the Reeds wanted to present. Elena straightened her back, her chin trembling but firm. She refused to show tears. Instead, she looked around the room, at the fine art on the walls, the gleaming floors, the perfectly dressed guests. They saw wealth and status as shields. She saw sacrifice as strength. Margaret lifted her glass, smiling with satisfaction. "The important thing is keeping the evening seamless." Elena's heart tightened, but she whispered silently to herself, "One day, truth will shine brighter than chandeliers." She didn't yet know how, but deep inside, she sensed that appearances could never bury what was real. And the day of the wedding would prove it. The Magnolia Grand Hotel rose like a jewel in the heart of downtown Dallas. Its glass facade reflected the glow of city lights, and inside, the marble lobby gleamed as though it had been polished for royalty. Guests in evening gowns and tailored tuxedos flowed through the revolving doors, their laughter mingling with the soft music of a string quartet. The ballroom itself was a world apart. Massive crystal chandeliers dripped from the ceiling, scattering light across gold-trimmed walls and polished oak floors. Round tables were covered with ivory linens, each one crowned with towering arrangements of white roses and orchids. Waiters in black vests moved with precision, adjusting silverware and filling glasses with champagne. Along one wall, a stage was set for the orchestra, their instruments already tuned, waiting for the signal to begin. At the front of the room, a pair of velvet chairs marked the place of honor for the bride and groom. Every detail screamed elegance and wealth. The air itself carried a fragrance of lilies and expensive perfume. For the Reeds, this was more than a wedding. It was a performance, a declaration of status. Guests whispered in admiration, snapping photos to post online, marveling at the spectacle. But in the shadows of that grandeur, another story was waiting to unfold. For amidst the glitter of crystal and the shimmer of silk gowns, one woman would walk into this ballroom with nothing but a simple navy dress and decades of sacrifice stitched into every thread of her being. The lights of Dallas sparkled beyond the windows, but the real drama was about to happen inside, and it had little to do with chandeliers. The evening began with a parade of wealth outside the Magnolia Grand. Luxury cars lined the circular driveway, sleek black Escalades, shining Mercedes sedans, even a Rolls-Royce that drew murmurs from the valet staff. Drivers in pressed uniforms opened doors, and guests stepped out as though walking onto a red carpet. Women floated past in gowns of satin and sequins, their jewels catching the light from the hotel's entrance. Men adjusted cufflinks and straightened bow ties, greeting each other with firm handshakes and practiced smiles. Their voices filled the air with talk of business deals, vacation homes, and charity galas. Inside the ballroom, the orchestra played softly, while waiters offered trays of champagne. Laughter rose in elegant waves as old friends reunited and introductions were made between powerful families. Conversations sparkled as brightly as the chandeliers overhead. Every detail spoke of prestige, the shoes, the handbags, the subtle sense of designer perfumes. Each guest seemed intent on proving they belonged in this circle of Dallas society. They complimented one another on gowns, hair, and watches, all while glancing around to see who might be watching them. It was a celebration, yes, but also a competition of appearances. Status was currency, and every guest spent it freely. As the grand ballroom filled with glamour, no one paid attention to the empty tables near the back. No one thought of the quiet figure who would soon walk through those same doors, wearing a dress that cost less than their cufflinks. They had no idea that the real story of the evening would not be written by them, but by someone they barely noticed. While the valets hurried to park luxury cars, a lone yellow cab pulled up to the edge of the Magnolia Grand's driveway. Its brakes squeaked as it stopped, and the driver stepped out to open the back door. From the cab emerged Elena Morales, holding a small black clutch in one hand and smoothing down the skirt of her navy blue dress with the other. The gown wasn't silk or designer lace. It was a clearance find from a discount store, yet Elena had ironed it with care, pressing every seam until it looked its best. She wore modest black shoes, polished the night before, and a pair of simple pearl earrings that had belonged to her mother. Stepping onto the marble walkway, Elena lifted her chin, determined to carry herself with quiet dignity, but the contrast was undeniable. Guests in glittering gowns swept past her without a second glance. Some glanced briefly at the taxi before turning back to their conversations, their smiles never breaking. Eleanor walked slowly into the lobby, her heart pounding. The chandeliers above dazzled her eyes, and the sound of the orchestra carried faintly from the ballroom. She clutched her purse tightly, whispering a silent prayer for courage. At the check-in table, an usher glanced at her card, then smiled politely. "Welcome, Mrs. Morales. Right this way." He didn't announce her name loudly, as he had with other guests. Instead, he guided her quickly through the crowd, past the grand tables filled with Dallas's elite. Elena followed, her eyes searching for Clara, longing for a smile, a wave, some acknowledgement. But her daughter was nowhere in sight. The usher's hand pointed discreetly toward the back of the room. And in that moment, Elena realized exactly where she belonged in this glittering world, or at least where they intended to place her. Elena followed the young usher across the polished oak floor, her shoes clicking softly against the wood. She tried to take in the splendor around her, the golden light from chandeliers, the laughter echoing from the front tables, but the path he led her on curved further and further away from the center of it all. At one point, Elena slowed, glancing toward the middle rows, where cousins and family friends had already gathered. She spotted familiar faces, people she had known since Clara's childhood, now seated closer to the stage. For a moment, Elena thought the usher had made a mistake. She opened her mouth to ask, but he simply kept walking, his polite smile never faltering. Finally, he stopped at a table pressed against the far wall, only a few feet from the swinging doors of the kitchen. The smell of roasted meat and garlic drifted through each time the doors flapped open. Waiters bustled in and out, balancing trays, barely noticing the guests seated nearby. "Here you are, Mrs. Morales," the usher said softly, pulling out a chair. His voice carried no malice, but no warmth either. Eleanor lowered herself into the chair, clutching her purse in her lap. She looked around the table. Strangers, distant acquaintances, people who barely knew Clara. None were close family. None would have chosen to sit with her. From her corner, Elena had a perfect view of the kitchen doors and the backs of servers rushing by. The stage at the front of the room felt miles away. She smiled faintly, as though this arrangement didn't sting, as though her heart hadn't cracked just a little more. But deep inside, she understood. This placement wasn't an accident, it was intentional, and the night had only begun. Elena settled into her seat at table 27, the furthest from the stage. The chair wobbled slightly against the tiled edge of the floor, a reminder that this corner of the ballroom wasn't meant for comfort. Every few seconds, the kitchen doors burst open, releasing a rush of heat, the clang of dishes and the hurried steps of servers balancing trays. Around her, the other guests at the table exchanged polite smiles. Most were distant acquaintances of the Reeds, co-workers, friends of friends, people invited out of obligation. None of them knew Elena beyond her name printed on the place card. Their conversations swirled around business, vacations, and private schools in Dallas. Elena tried to follow, but the words felt foreign. She sipped her water and glanced toward the front. From this angle, the head table looked like a stage in another world. She could barely make out Clara's chair, draped in white silk. Each time Elena turned her head, another waiter brushed past, whispering, "Excuse me," as he rushed to the kitchen. One even bumped her chair, barely noticing. She smiled faintly, as if unbothered, though her chest tightened with each interruption. She imagined how it would look in photographs, her hidden in the shadows, no one capturing the pride she longed to show. A mother reduced to a background detail. Still, Elena straightened her back and folded her hands neatly on the table. If this was the place they gave her, then she would endure it with quiet strength. But as the music swelled and laughter rose from the front, a single thought echoed in her mind. A mother does not belong in the shadows of her child's joy, and someday, everyone in this room would know it. As the evening unfolded, Elena kept her eyes on the stage, trying to catch glimpses of Clara. Yet every so often, she caught the weight of sideways glances from nearby tables. A pair of women in sequined gowns leaned toward each other, their voices low but sharp. "Isn't that the lady from the laundromat on Jefferson?" one murmured. The other nodded, eyes narrowing. "Yes, I'm sure of it. I took my husband's shirts there last year. I never imagined she was related to the bride." Eleanor felt the heat rise in her cheeks. She looked down at her hands, twisting the napkin in her lap. More whispers rippled through the room, not cruel exactly, but filled with surprise, as though her presence did not belong in such a polished setting. At another table, a man chuckled softly. "From the laundromat to the Magnolia Grand. Quite the leap." His companion laughed, though quickly hushed him. Every word reached Elena's ears like a pinprick. She had always carried pride in her work, clean clothes, honest labor. But here, under chandeliers and among silk gowns, her life's work was reduced to gossip. Still, she lifted her chin and forced a calm expression. She reminded herself that dignity came not from where you sat, but from how you carried yourself. Yet inside, the sting remained. What no one realized was that behind every pressed shirt and every mended hem, Elena had been building the very future being celebrated tonight. The irony was bitter, and though the guests whispered as if she were invisible, she knew her story could not stay hidden forever. The truth has a way of surfacing, especially on nights meant for perfection. From the front of the ballroom, Clara looked radiant in her gown, seated at the head table beside Jonathan. Photographers circled like bees, snapping every angle of her smile. Glasses clinked, and the orchestra filled the air with polished notes. At one point, Clara's eyes wandered beyond the bright circle of chandeliers. Her gaze fell on the far corner of the room, table 27. There, she spotted her mother sitting straight in her simple navy dress, a faint smile frozen on her face. For a brief moment, Clara's chest tightened. Memories flickered, nights when she had fallen asleep to the hum of her mother's sewing machine, mornings when a packed lunch waited despite empty cupboards. For a heartbeat, she almost rose from her chair. Almost. But then Margaret leaned close, whispering something in her ear. Clara forced a smile for the guests at her table, nodding at a compliment about the flowers. She glanced back toward her mother only once more, quickly this time, before turning away. From the shadows, Eleanor noticed, she saw her daughter's eyes reach her, then slip away. She felt the invisible barrier, as solid as the marble walls of the hotel. Eleanor pressed her napkin into her lap, steadying her hands. She told herself, she is nervous. She has so much on her mind. But deep down, she knew the truth. Clara could have called her closer. She could have bridged the distance with a smile, a wave, a gesture. Instead, Elena remained in the corner as the celebration continued without her, and the silence between them grew louder than the orchestra's song. As the evening progressed, Jonathan raised his glass when guests approached, offering practiced smiles and polite conversation. Yet between greetings, his eyes drifted toward the back of the room. He had caught sight of Elena sitting at table 27, her posture straight, but her expression quietly strained. He noticed how waiters nearly brushed against her chair each time the kitchen doors swung open. He noticed how she nodded politely at strangers who barely acknowledged her. And he noticed the faint shadow in her smile when her eyes lingered on Clara at the head table. For a moment, Jonathan's jaw tightened. He knew this wasn't right. A mother shouldn't be placed near the clatter of dishes while distant acquaintances filled the prime seats. But then Margaret's laughter rang in his ear as she leaned close to speak with a guest, and Jonathan's courage faltered. He told himself, it's only one night. It's easier not to stir conflict now. He raised his glass again, drowning his unease in another sip of champagne. Clara, radiant beside him, seemed oblivious, or perhaps willfully blind. Jonathan wanted to believe she hadn't noticed, but deep down, he knew she had. So he smiled wider, asked a guest about their ranch in Houston, and let the discomfort slide into silence. His heart whispered that something was wrong, but his lips remained closed, and from the shadows of table 27, Elena's quiet suffering went unanswered. The orchestra swelled with another song, the chandeliers blazed, and the distance between truth and appearances stretched even wider. At a table closer to the middle of the ballroom, Sam Carter sat with her husband, her eyes drifting again and again toward the back. She had known Clara since they were little girls, running barefoot in Oak Cliff streets, eating Elena's homemade tamales after school. To see Elena now, alone, tucked near swinging kitchen doors, lit a fire inside her. Sam watched as servers rushed past Elena's chair, nearly bumping her each time. She noticed the polite nods, the forced smiles, the way strangers at her table turned conversations away from her. Most of all, she noticed Clara. Not once had the bride walked toward her mother, not once had she acknowledged the woman who had given up everything for her. Sam's jaw tightened. She leaned closer to her husband. This isn't right. Elena should be sitting in the front, not hidden like an afterthought. Her husband shifted uncomfortably. Don't make a scene, Sam. It's their wedding. Sam's eyes burned with quiet fury. A mother doesn't belong by the kitchen. I don't care whose wedding it is. She sat back, her mind racing. The injustice felt unbearable. Elena had always been more than just Clara's mother to Sam. She had been a second mum, the one who cheered from the bleachers at school games, who brought food when Sam's own family struggled. Now, Sam's chest tightened with resolve. If Clara and Jonathan wouldn't honor Eleanor, someone had to. She picked up her wineglass, staring at the stage where speeches would soon be made. A plan was already forming. The truth, Sam thought, wouldn't stay buried in the back corner forever. As the waiters cleared the last plates from the tables, the orchestra shifted into a softer melody. A man in a dark suit, the master of ceremonies, stepped up to the microphone near the stage. His voice carried smoothly across the glittering room. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight for this beautiful celebration. After dinner, we will have the toasts, words from family, friends, and of course the bride and groom themselves. Applause rippled through the ballroom. Guests turned toward the stage with eager smiles, already anticipating heartfelt words and playful stories. At the head table, Clara beamed as Jonathan slipped his arm around her chair. From the back, Eleanor's heart fluttered. She had dreamed of speaking that night, of telling the room how proud she was, how she had prayed for this moment since Clara's first steps. But she remembered Margaret's earlier remark about keeping speeches polished and brief. The message had been clear. Her voice wasn't wanted. She folded her napkin slowly, her throat tight. At another table, Sam Carter set her wineglass down with purpose. Her eyes narrowed on the microphone, and a decision took shape. If Elena's voice was silenced, maybe another could rise in her place. Jonathan glanced toward the back of the room for just a second, catching sight of Elena again. Her small, quiet figure, so far from the chandeliers, struck him like a shadow against the grandeur. He looked away quickly, his jaw tight as applause faded. The orchestra swelled once more. The moment for words was coming, and with it, a chance for truth to shatter the polished surface of the night. Dinner began with silver domes lifted from plates at the front tables, revealing elegant dishes of sea bass and roasted vegetables. Waiters glided between guests, pouring wine and offering bread baskets. Laughter rose with every toast of champagne. At table 27, Eleanor unfolded her napkin and placed it on her lap. A plate was set before her, just like everyone else's, but the presentation here seemed rushed. The fish was slightly cooled by the time it reached her, and the waiter barely paused before hurrying back through the swinging kitchen doors. Around her, the strangers at the table engaged in small talk about business mergers, ski trips to Colorado, and country club memberships. Elena nodded politely when someone glanced her way, but no one asked about her, not really. They filled the silence with their own stories and soon forgot she was even there. Elena forced a smile, cutting her food slowly, though her appetite was gone. She looked toward the front where Clara sat glowing, surrounded by friends and family who clapped at every word from the microphone. From her corner, Eleanor's view was blocked by waiters passing with trays. She lifted her water glass and whispered softly, "To you, mija." May your life be happy." Her toast was unheard, swallowed by the noise of the kitchen doors slamming open again. She told herself she didn't mind, that it was enough just to be in the room. But as she chewed in silence, the truth pressed heavy. She was not sharing in her daughter's joy. She was only watching it from the shadows, and deep inside, the ache of invisibility grew harder to ignore. As the orchestra played softly, conversations at the front tables turned casual and curious. A woman in a sequined emerald dress leaned toward her husband, whispering just loud enough for others to hear. "Strange, isn't it? I've seen Jonathan's parents several times tonight, but where's the bride's father? And the mother? Was she even invited?" Her husband shrugged, sipping his champagne. "Perhaps there isn't much family on her side. You know how these things are." Another guest chimed in. "I heard she was raised by a single mother. Surprising, considering how polished Clara turned out." The comment drew a ripple of polite laughter, though not all found it amusing. Jonathan shifted in his chair, glancing at Clara. Her smile faltered for a moment, then she quickly raised her glass to distract the group. "We're just so grateful you all could be here tonight," she said brightly. But the whispers didn't stop. More questions floated between the tables. Why isn't the bride's mother up front? Why is her family so invisible? Margaret's voice cut through the murmurs, cool and practiced. The seating was arranged to keep the evening seamless. It's better this way. Clara lowered her eyes, the comment heavy in her ears. From the far corner, Elena watched the clinking glasses and elegant smiles. She couldn't hear every word, but she saw the curious glances. She knew what they meant. To the crowd at the front, she was little more than an unanswered question. Yet the answer to that question carried more weight than anyone at those tables realized, and the night had only begun to reveal it. Between courses, waiters refilled glasses and cleared plates, weaving smoothly through the crowded ballroom. At the head table, Margaret leaned slightly toward a cluster of relatives from Houston, her voice carrying farther than she realized. "It's remarkable how weddings gather such different kinds of people," she said with a delicate laugh. "But really, some people should know their place. Not everyone fits in the same spotlight." The words hovered in the air, sharp as broken glass. A few guests chuckled politely, unsure whether to agree. Others shifted in their chairs, uncomfortable but unwilling to speak. Jonathan's fork froze mid-air. His jaw tightened, though he forced a polite smile. Clara pretended to sip her wine, her eyes fixed on the tablecloth. At table 27, Elena didn't hear every syllable, but she caught enough. The tone, the sideways glances, she knew who those words were meant for. Heat rose in her chest, but she kept her face calm. She had learned long ago that silence was sometimes the only shield. Still, the sting reached her bones. For years, Eleanor had taught Clara that dignity came from hard work, not titles. Yet here she was, treated like clutter hidden behind the kitchen doors. Around her, guests shifted uncomfortably, sensing the undercurrent. A whisper here, a glance there, the tension spread like ripples on water. Margaret smiled, raising her glass as if nothing had been said. But her words had already settled into the room, echoing louder than the orchestra, and though Elena remained seated quietly in her corner, one truth grew clearer by the minute. Silence could not last forever. Someone would break it, and when that happened, the entire hall would listen. Jonathan sat stiffly at the head table, his champagne glass untouched. Margaret's words still hung in the air, sharper than the clink of silverware. He felt a knot in his stomach as he glanced toward the back of the room. From across the ballroom, he saw Elena, small and quiet at table 27, pretending to be engrossed in her meal, while servers rushed past her chair. For a moment, Jonathan's instincts urged him to rise, to walk across the polished floor, to bring her forward, where she belonged. But then he caught Margaret's steady gaze. Her expression was calm, polished, unyielding. She didn't need to repeat herself. Her authority was carved into every detail of this wedding. Jonathan cleared his throat, setting down his glass. A cousin leaned toward him, asking about the honeymoon destination, and he answered with practiced ease. His voice sounded smooth, but his mind churned. He thought about the nights Elena had quietly helped him years ago, offering meals when he struggled to find his footing in Dallas. He remembered her kindness, her humility, and yet here he was, motionless, the eyes of the Reed family, the weight of appearances, the fear of disruption, they all pressed on him like chains. Clara glanced at him, her smile brittle. She knew he had noticed, but she also knew he wouldn't act. Not now. Jonathan raised his glass again, forcing a smile. The orchestra played, guests laughed, and the evening moved forward as though nothing had been said. But in Jonathan's chest, guilt gnawed like a restless shadow. He knew silence had a cost, and sooner or later, that cost would come due. As the dinner carried on, Clara laughed at jokes from Jonathan's colleagues, posed for photos with friends, and nodded at every compliment about her gown. On the surface, she was the perfect bride, radiant under the chandeliers. Yet every so often her eyes flickered toward the farthest corner of the ballroom. From her seat at the head table, Clara could just make out her mother's figure. Elena sat straight, her hands folded neatly, her smile polite but faint. Each time a waiter pushed through the kitchen doors, Clara saw the rush of air disturb her mother's hair, the clatter of dishes breaking through the music. The image pricked at her heart. For a brief moment, Clara's chest tightened with guilt. She remembered childhood nights when her mother worked late, the hum of the sewing machine filling their apartment. She remembered falling asleep to the sound of Elena's soft singing in Spanish. But then Margaret leaned close, whispering about the importance of staying focused on the guests in front. "Smile, darling. Don't let your nerves show. This night is about you and Jonathan." Clara forced her gaze back to the people around her. She lifted her glass, laughed at a story, and let the cameras flash. To the crowd, she looked effortless, glowing. Inside, however, her stomach churned. She avoided turning her head again, because if she met her mother's eyes, if she truly looked, she feared the facade might crack. So Clara smiled wider, holding her place in the glittering center of the ballroom, while her mother remained in the shadows. The distance between them had never felt greater. Between courses, Sam Carter excused herself from her table and slipped toward the back. She approached Elena's corner with a gentle smile, pulling out the empty chair beside her. "Elena," she said softly, "you look beautiful tonight." Elena returned the smile, though it barely reached her eyes. "Thank you, Sam. I'm glad you're here." Sam glanced around the table, the strangers chatting about vacations in Aspen, the constant swing of the kitchen doors, the way Elena sat like a guest at her own daughter's wedding, but apart from it. Sam's jaw tightened. "This isn't right. You should be up front, not back here." Elena shook her head quickly. "Please don't make a fuss. Clara worked so hard for this day. I don't want to cause her any shame." "Shame?" Sam repeated, her voice low but firm. "Elena, you raised her alone. You gave her everything. If anyone should be ashamed, it's the people who put you here." Elena's eyes glistened, but she blinked the tears away. She smoothed her napkin and straightened her posture. "I am fine, really. I'm just happy to see her so radiant." Sam leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Don't hide your pain from me. I've seen too much of what you've done for her. One day, Elena, people will know the truth. I promise you that." Elena gave a small nod, grateful but cautious. She looked back toward the stage, whispering almost to herself, "Sometimes silence is the only gift a mother can give." Sam studied her face, recognizing both strength and heartbreak. And in her own heart, a decision began to form, one that would not let silence win. The orchestra shifted to a slower tune, violins weaving a delicate melody through the chatter of the ballroom. Glasses clinked, laughter rolled from the front tables, but at the very back the mood was different. Elena sat with her hands folded tightly on her lap, her eyes fixed on the stage, yet unfocused. She blinked often, fighting the burn of tears that threatened to spill. The more she tried to hold them back, the harder they pressed, until her chest ached with the effort. A waiter brushed past, bumping her chair. "Sorry, ma'am," he muttered before disappearing through the kitchen doors. Elena smiled faintly, shaking her head as though it hadn't mattered, but inside the sting deepened. She glanced at Clara, glowing in the spotlight at the head table. Guests leaned in to compliment the bride, her laughter echoing like bells. Eleanor remembered when that laugh had belonged to a little girl playing hopscotch in the cracked sidewalks of Oak Cliff. A little girl who once ran into her mother's arms without hesitation. Now the distance between them felt wider than the length of the ballroom. Elena pressed the napkin to her lips, drawing a shaky breath. She whispered a silent prayer. "Let me make it through this night without breaking." But Sam, sitting nearby, saw the truth in her trembling hands and glassy eyes. The weight in the air was unmistakable. Every glance toward the back table seemed heavier, every note from the orchestra sadder. The ballroom sparkled, but Elena sat in shadow, holding back tears that told a story no chandelier could hide. Sam leaned back in her chair, her eyes never straying far from Elena. The injustice gnawed at her like a steady drumbeat. Around them, guests laughed, waiters carried silver trays, and the orchestra swelled with polished notes. But all Sam could see was her friend's mother, sitting in the shadows as though she were a stranger. She caught the attention of a waiter and lifted 2 fingers. "A glass of red, please," she said firmly. Moments later, a ruby-colored wine swirled into her glass. Sam took a slow sip, steadying herself. Her mind raced. She had promised Elena that people would know the truth one day. Why not tonight? Why not here, when the entire Reed family and half of Dallas's elite were watching? Sam glanced at the stage, where the microphone stood ready for the speeches. She pictured herself walking up, her heels clicking against the floor, her voice cutting through the practiced politeness of the evening. She could tell everyone about the nights Elena worked until dawn, about the years of sacrifice, about the quiet strength that had built the very foundation of Clara's success. The thought filled her with a strange calm. Courage settled into her chest, replacing the anger with determination. She looked at Elena, who was pretending to smile at something a stranger at the table had said. Sam shook her head softly. Enough was enough. Taking another sip of wine, she whispered under her breath, "If they won't honor you, I will." And with that promise, a plan began to take root, one that would change the tone of the entire evening. The lights dimmed slightly, and the orchestra shifted to a soft melody. A DJ in a tailored black suit stepped onto the stage, his voice carrying smoothly over the hum of conversation. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, smiling as he held the microphone, "thank you for being here tonight to celebrate Clara and Jonathan. Now it's time for one of the most anticipated parts of the evening, the toasts." Applause rippled through the ballroom. Glasses clinked as servers hurried to refill champagne flutes. Guests leaned forward with eager smiles, ready to hear stories of love, friendship, and family. At the head table, Clara's cheeks glowed as she turned to Jonathan. He gave her hand a reassuring squeeze, though his eyes flickered briefly toward the back of the hall. Eleanor remained seated at table 27, her hands tightening around her clutch. She had dreamed of this moment for years, but she knew it was not hers to take. Margaret's earlier words had been sharp enough to keep her silent. From her seat in the middle rows, Sam Carter felt her heartbeat quicken. She set her wineglass down, her eyes fixed on the microphone. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment to pull truth into the light. The DJ continued, "First we'll hear from the maid of honor, followed by the best man, and after that," he grinned, "anyone who wishes to share a few words about the couple." The crowd applauded again, cheerful and unsuspecting. Elena lowered her gaze, resigned. But Sam's lips curved into a determined line. She knew her chance was coming, and when it did, the ballroom would hear what no one had planned for. The maid of honor finished her toast with a flourish, prompting laughter and applause. The best man followed, telling a polished story about Jonathan's college days. Glasses lifted, champagne flowed, and the atmosphere swelled with light-hearted cheer. Then the DJ stepped forward again. "And now," he said warmly, "we'll hear from our bride and groom." Before he could finish, Sam Carter rose from her chair. Her heels clicked firmly against the ballroom floor as she made her way toward the stage. Heads turned, whispers rose, but Sam's face was calm, her eyes clear. Clara's smile faltered. Jonathan blinked in surprise. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. Sam reached the microphone, giving the DJ a polite nod. "If you'll allow me, I'd like to say a few words first," she said. The room hushed. It wasn't planned, but the unexpectedness drew attention like a spark in the dark. Sam looked across the sea of tables. Her gaze lingered on the farthest corner, on the woman sitting quietly by the kitchen doors. Elena's eyes widened slightly, her hands trembling around her clutch. Sam's voice softened, yet carried strong and steady. "I've known Clara since we were little girls. And there's someone here tonight who deserves to be seen for who she truly is." A ripple moved through the crowd. Clara shifted in her seat, her fingers tightening around her napkin. Sam took a breath, her resolve unshakable. "Before we hear from the bride and groom, it's time everyone knows the story behind this day." The ballroom stilled. The chandeliers glittered above, but all eyes were fixed on the woman at the microphone, ready for truths that no one had expected to hear. Sam rested her hands lightly on the microphone stand, her lips curving into a friendly smile. "What a beautiful evening," she began, her voice smooth and casual. "I think we can all agree this wedding is absolutely stunning. The flowers, the music, the food, it's like something out of a dream." Guests chuckled softly, nodding in agreement. The tension eased for a moment. Sam let her eyes sweep the room, holding the crowd with an ease that came from years of speaking to students and parents at her school. "But," she continued, her tone slowing, deepening, "dreams don't come true without someone working hard for them. And tonight, I can't celebrate this couple without also celebrating the person who made all of this possible." The room grew quieter. Margaret shifted in her seat, her fingers tightening on her wineglass. Clara's smile froze, brittle at the edges. Sam's gaze moved toward the back of the ballroom, where Eleanor sat still as stone. "I grew up with Clara. I spent afternoons at her home, I ate meals at her table, and I saw with my own eyes the woman who gave everything she had so Clara could stand here today." A murmur moved through the guests. Jonathan sat forward, listening. Sam's voice steadied, strong and full. "That woman is Elena Morales. And I think it's time this room understands who she really is, not just the mother of the bride, but the reason this day exists." The chandeliers glittered above, but the ballroom had fallen silent. Guests turned in their seats, following Sam's gaze toward the back corner. For the first time that evening, all eyes began to search for Eleanor. Sam held the microphone a little tighter, her voice clear, her eyes never leaving the back of the room. "When we were kids, Clara and I would sit at her kitchen table doing homework. And while we worked, We heard the hum of a sewing machine in the next room. Night after night, that machine never stopped. The crowd leaned in, the clinking of glasses fading. That was Elena. She sewed clothes for neighbors, for strangers, anyone who needed it. She worked until her fingers were raw, until her eyes were heavy. And why? So Clara could stay in school, so she could have books, uniforms, and the chance at a future. A soft gasp came from one of the guests. Others glanced at one another, their polished smiles slipping into something more thoughtful. Sam's voice grew steadier, charged with emotion. There were nights Elena skipped dinner so Clara wouldn't miss hers. There were winters when the heat barely worked, but Clara always had what she needed. That machine, those endless stitches, were the foundation of the success you see today. At the head table, Clara's eyes shimmered with unease. She reached for her napkin, twisting it in her hands, avoiding her mother's gaze. Sam took a breath, her words now firm. This wedding is breathtaking, yes. But its beauty isn't in the chandeliers or the gowns. It's in the quiet sacrifices of a woman who gave everything for her daughter. Silence fell over the ballroom. Guests turned fully toward table 27, where Elena sat frozen, her eyes glistening. For the first time all evening, the spotlight of attention shifted, not to the chandeliers, not to the bride, but to the woman hidden in the shadows. The ballroom filled with a low buzz, soft at first, then spreading like ripples across a pond. Elegant heads turned, sparkling earrings catching the light as whispers passed from table to table. "Is that her? At the back?" one woman asked, craning her neck. "Yes," another replied, pointing discreetly. "The lady in the navy dress near the kitchen doors." All at once, the same eyes that had ignored Elena for hours now sought her out. Strangers stared openly, curious, some with respect, others with quiet guilt. The woman they had overlooked was suddenly at the center of attention. Elena shifted in her chair, her hands trembling against her clutch. She felt the weight of hundreds of gazes pressing down on her. She wanted to disappear, yet she also felt something else rising, an ache of long-denied recognition. At the head table, Clara's chest tightened. She saw it happening. Her mother no longer invisible, her sacrifices unveiled before the most powerful guests of the evening. Clara forced a brittle smile, but the corners of her mouth quivered. Margaret Reed's face hardened, her polite mask cracking at the edges. She leaned toward a relative, whispering sharply, "This is not the time for sentiment." But the words no longer carried authority. The crowd wasn't listening to her. Sam stood tall at the microphone, her voice calm. "You see, this wedding didn't begin with gowns and chandeliers. It began with a mother sitting at a sewing machine, dreaming of something better for her child." The murmurs grew softer. The attention in the room shifted fully now, like a spotlight swinging across the stage, and all of it landed on Elena Morales. Sam steadied herself, her voice gaining weight with each word. "I remember one story most of all. It was our senior year of high school. Everyone was talking about prom, dresses, limousines, photographs. Clara didn't know if she could afford to go. She told me she might skip it." The ballroom grew still, forks frozen above plates. Sam continued, her eyes locked on Clara for a moment before turning back to the crowd. But then, one evening, Elena placed a box on Clara's bed. Inside was a dress she had sewn by hand. Hours and hours of work. Clara looked beautiful in it. She danced all night. No one ever knew the truth behind that dress. Her voice dropped lower, carrying a sharper edge. What no one saw was that Elena had skipped meals for weeks to buy the fabric. She hid her hunger behind a smile. She chose her daughter's joy over her own needs, again and again. A soft gasp echoed from one of the front tables. A woman dabbed her eyes with a napkin. A man shook his head slowly, as though ashamed for not knowing sooner. Clara pressed her lips together, blinking quickly. She remembered that night, the laughter, the music, the pride she felt walking into the ballroom at school, but she had never thought about what it had cost her mother. Not until now. At the back, Eleanor bowed her head. The memory washed over her, both painful and tender. She hadn't wanted recognition for those sacrifices, but hearing them spoken aloud, in front of all these people, pierced her heart in ways she hadn't expected. And for the first time, the grandeur of the Magnolia Grand seemed small compared to the quiet power of truth. Sam's final words about Eleanor's hunger seemed to hang in the air long after she stopped speaking. The clink of forks against plates ceased. The hum of whispered conversations vanished. Even the waiters froze mid-step, their trays balanced carefully in their hands. The orchestra, sensing the shift, let the last note of their song fade into nothing. In the vast ballroom, filled with hundreds of people, not a single sound remained. All eyes were fixed on Elena Morales. The woman who had entered in a taxi, wearing a simple navy dress, now sat at the center of the story. Her shoulders trembled, her hands pressed tightly around her clutch. She had spent the evening in the shadows, unseen. Now she felt the weight of every gaze upon her. At the head table, Clara's throat tightened. The smile she had worn all night crumbled. She stared at her mother, her chest aching with a mixture of shame and sorrow. Jonathan leaned forward, his expression troubled, as though realizing he had stayed silent too long. Margaret Reed's lips parted, ready to object, but no words came. The atmosphere was too heavy, too absolute. Authority had slipped from her grasp. Sam lowered the microphone, allowing the silence to linger. She knew the pause itself was more powerful than any flourish of words. It gave the room time to breathe, to absorb, to feel the gravity of truth. And in that silence the contrast was stark. Chandeliers and gowns glittered, but all of it seemed pale compared to the quiet dignity of a mother who had once chosen hunger so her daughter could shine. At the head table, Clara sat frozen, her fingers clenched tightly around her champagne flute. The ballroom's silence pressed against her like a heavy weight, and every second felt louder than the last. She dared to glance toward the back of the room, where her mother sat small and trembling, her eyes glistening. Clara's chest tightened. She remembered that prom night, how radiant she had felt in the handmade dress, how proud she was when her classmates complimented her. But she had never asked how her mother had managed to afford it. She had never wondered what it had cost. And now, hearing the truth spoken out loud, shame burned hotter than the chandeliers above. Her throat ached as she swallowed hard. She lowered her head, unable to meet her mother's gaze. The laughter she had rehearsed for the evening vanished, replaced by the pounding of her heart. Beside her, Jonathan shifted, watching her closely. "Clara," he whispered, his voice low, but she didn't respond. Margaret placed a hand on Clara's arm, as though urging her to stay composed. But the touch only deepened the conflict inside her. Clara pulled her arm gently away, her hands now trembling in her lap. She had longed for a perfect night, flawless and polished, free of discomfort. Instead, the perfection she had built now felt like glass, shattering under the weight of truth. Clara kept her head bowed, her hair falling forward to shield her face. She knew the room was still watching, waiting for her reaction, but she had none to give. Shame held her still, silent and small, and for the first time that evening, she no longer felt like the star of her own wedding. The silence in the ballroom gnawed at Margaret Reed. Her polished smile faltered, though only for a second. She set her wineglass down with a delicate clink, straightened her pearl necklace, and leaned forward slightly as if to reclaim control of the evening. "Well," she said, her voice carrying a forced lightness, "that was certainly touching. But let's remember, tonight is about celebration, not dwelling on the past. Every family has its stories, don't they? A few guests shifted uneasily in their chairs. Some nodded politely, eager to smooth the tension, but most remained quiet, their eyes still drawn toward Eleanor at the back of the hall. Margaret's lips curved into a practiced smile, but her eyes were sharp. We mustn't forget that this is Jonathan and Clara's night. The spotlight belongs to them. Her words floated across the room like brittle glass, but they didn't land the way she intended. Instead of easing the discomfort, they sharpened it. Guests exchanged sidelong glances, as if silently questioning her dismissal. At the head table, Jonathan's jaw tightened. He glanced at Clara, who still kept her head bowed, her face pale under the chandelier's glow. Margaret's attempt to minimize what had been said only deepened the contrast between appearances and truth. From the stage, Sam Carter remained at the microphone, her gaze steady. She didn't interrupt, but her silence held more power than Margaret's words, and at table 27, Elena sat quietly, her hands trembling, but her eyes lifted. For once, she wasn't invisible. No amount of polished phrases could erase what the room had already felt. Truth had been spoken, and no cold smile could cover it. Sam let Margaret's words hang in the air for a moment, then leaned closer to the microphone. Her voice was calm, but it carried an iron edge that cut through the ballroom. "With respect, Mrs. Reed," she said firmly, "this isn't just a family story to be brushed aside. It's the truth, and the truth matters, especially tonight." Gasps rippled quietly across the crowd. Margaret's smile froze, but Sam continued without hesitation. She raised her hand and pointed toward the farthest corner. "Look at her. Look at the woman sitting at that table, Elena Morales. She didn't ask for chandeliers or luxury. She didn't ask for recognition. But without her, there would be no bride walking in white, no celebration in this hall, no marriage to honor. It is because of her that we are all here tonight." Every head turned once more toward table 27. Elena's face flushed as dozens of eyes met hers. She pressed her hands against her chest as if steadying her heart. Sam's voice trembled slightly now, thick with emotion. "She is the one who carried the weight when no one else would. She is the one who believed in Clara before anyone else did. If there is one person who deserves the front row tonight, it's her." The room was silent, except for the orchestra's faint hum in the background. Some guests blinked away tears. Others bowed their heads, struck by the gravity of the moment. From the head table, Clara stared at her mother, her eyes glistening. Jonathan leaned forward, listening intently, his face pale with realization. The evening, so carefully orchestrated for perfection, now belonged to truth, and it was Eleanor who stood at its center. For a heartbeat, the ballroom held its breath. Then, from one of the middle tables, a guest slowly stood and began to clap. The sound was hesitant at first, echoing against the high ceiling. Another person rose, then another, until the entire room was on its feet. Applause thundered through the hall, filling every corner. It wasn't the polite, rehearsed kind of clapping that accompanied speeches at weddings. It was raw, full, and charged with something deeper, recognition. Elena sat frozen, her hands clutching her clutch so tightly the leather creaked. She had never been the focus of such attention. Her cheeks flushed, her eyes wide with disbelief. Tears welled, no longer held back, spilling freely as she looked around the room. Guests who had whispered earlier now applauded with genuine emotion. Some nodded toward her with respect. A woman dabbed her eyes with a napkin. A man pressed his hand to his chest, as if the moment had struck him personally. At the head table, Clara felt her throat tighten. The sound of applause for her mother rang louder than the orchestra, louder than her own rehearsed laughter had all night. She wiped at her eyes quickly, her carefully built facade collapsing. Margaret remained seated, her jaw tight, her hands gripping her wineglass, but even she could not silence the roar of clapping that shook the room. Sam lowered the microphone, her eyes glistening, satisfied that the truth had finally broken through the polished surface. And in that moment, Elena Morales, once hidden by the kitchen doors, became the honored soul of the wedding. The applause thundered on, echoing against the marble walls until it felt like the very chandeliers trembled with it. Eleanor sat stunned, tears streaking her cheeks, while Sam slowly stepped back from the microphone. At the head table, Jonathan rose to his feet. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat louder than the clapping around him. He glanced at Clara, then at Margaret, whose expression remained icy and unmoved. But Jonathan's eyes were fixed on Elena at the back of the hall. He extended a hand toward the DJ. "Please," he said, his voice firm yet shaking with emotion, "let me speak." The DJ handed him the microphone without hesitation. The applause began to fade, curiosity sweeping through the guests as Jonathan took the stage. He stood tall, in his black tuxedo, the groom at the center of attention, but his voice carried a weight no one expected. He held the microphone close, his tone solemn. What Sam said, every word is true. His gaze swept the room before settling on Eleanor again. And I have something to add. Because this story isn't just about Clara, it's about me, too. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Elena blinked, confusion in her eyes. Jonathan's throat tightened, but he pressed on. When I first met Clara, I was trying to build my career, but there was a season when I nearly lost everything. And someone helped me, quietly, without asking for anything in return. That someone was Elena Morales. Gasps echoed through the hall. All eyes turned back to Elena, whose trembling hands pressed against her chest. Jonathan's voice grew stronger. Tonight, before I stand as Clara's husband, I need to stand as Eleanor's son-in-law and say thank you. The ballroom fell into stunned silence once more, hanging on what he would say next. Jonathan's voice carried across the ballroom, steady now, though his eyes glistened with the weight of memory. Most of you don't know this, but when I first moved back to Dallas, things weren't as polished as they look tonight. I was fresh out of grad school, buried in debt, and desperate to prove myself in finance. And there was a moment, a long stretch, when I couldn't even afford groceries. The guests leaned in, murmurs rippling through the hall. This was not the kind of confession expected at a wedding filled with Dallas's elite. Jonathan continued, his gaze fixed on the woman at the back of the room. Elena Morales saw me at my lowest, and she didn't hesitate. She packed meals for me. She slipped me envelopes with just enough cash to keep me afloat. She believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. She treated me like family before I even belonged to hers. Elena pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, her heart pounding. She remembered those months, how Jonathan had stopped by the laundromat under the excuse of picking up Clara, how she had noticed his tired eyes, the hollow look of someone trying to hide struggle. Without fanfare, she had done what she always did, helped. Jonathan's voice deepened, the room hanging on every word. So when I tell you, this woman is the reason we are here tonight, I don't just mean because she raised Clara. I mean because she carried me too. Without her, I would not be the man standing here today. The chandeliers sparkled above, but all the light seemed to fall on the navy blue dress at the back of the hall. And for the first time that night, Eleanor felt the entire room see her, not as a shadow, but as the pillar she had always been. Jonathan's voice steadied as he gripped the microphone tighter, his chest swelling with conviction. Tonight, I didn't just marry Clara. I also married into something greater, the honor, the sacrifice, and the strength of the Morales family. The room stirred, a wave of murmurs sweeping through the tables. Guests exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement, others blinking back emotion. Jonathan's eyes never left Elena. Elena Morales is not simply the mother of the bride. She is the reason this day exists. She built this dream with her bare hands, one late night, one sacrificed meal, one prayer whispered over her daughter at a time. Without her, there would be no bride walking down the aisle, no celebration in this hall, and no future for me to share with Clara. His voice caught for a moment, but he pressed on. So when I said my vows earlier, I knew I was promising them not just to Clara, but to the legacy of the woman who raised her. I promised to honor her sacrifices. I promised to carry the Morales name with pride, as much as I carry my own. Gasps rippled across the ballroom. A few guests wiped at their eyes. Others clapped softly, the emotion too heavy for restraint. At the back table, Eleanor shook her head in disbelief, tears streaming down her cheeks. Her hands pressed against her chest, as though trying to hold her heart in place. Margaret's smile was gone now, replaced by a rigid stillness. The night she had tried to sculpt into perfection was unraveling into something she could no longer control. But for everyone else in the room, Jonathan's words rang like truth, pure and undeniable. The ballroom held its breath as Jonathan lowered the microphone. He didn't wait for applause. Instead, he handed it back to the DJ and stepped down from the stage. His polished shoes echoed against the hardwood floor, each step purposeful, steady, and loud in the silence. Guests turned in their seats to follow him, their eyes wide with anticipation. Conversations hushed, champagne glasses paused mid-air. All attention moved with him as he cut across the glittering room, leaving the head table and chandeliers behind. Clara's breath caught as she watched her groom stride away from her, his gaze fixed on the farthest corner. Margaret's lips parted, her voice sharp with alarm. "Jonathan!" But he didn't stop. The orchestra's instruments lay silent, as though even the music refused to interrupt. Elena sat frozen at table 27, her hands gripping her clutch so tightly her knuckles whitened. Her heart pounded. She had never been the center of so many eyes, never imagined the groom himself would walk past powerful families, past glittering gowns, past all the perfection, to reach her. Jonathan's steps slowed as he drew close, his eyes never leaving hers. For a moment, it was as if the two of them were alone in the ballroom, surrounded not by wealth or grandeur, but by the weight of gratitude unspoken for too long. And when he stopped in front of her chair, the silence was absolute. All that remained was the question hanging in the air. What would he do next? Jonathan stopped beside table 27, the ballroom still as stone. Elena looked up at him, her eyes wide, her chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. For a moment she thought he might simply offer words, a polite acknowledgement, but then, slowly and deliberately, he extended his hand toward her. Gasps rippled through the guests. From the head table, Clara covered her mouth with trembling fingers. Margaret stiffened, her pearls gleaming under the lights as her face hardened in disbelief. Elena hesitated, her hand trembling on her lap. She had spent the evening shrinking into the shadows, unseen. To place her hand in his now meant stepping into a light she never asked for. "Please," Jonathan said softly, his voice carrying across the room. "Stand with me." His tone held no pretense, no performance. Only truth. Tears blurred Elena's vision as she slowly lifted her hand. Jonathan clasped it firmly, with respect and with the steadiness of a vow. He helped her rise from her chair, and the room erupted in applause, this time louder, fuller, unstoppable. Elena's simple navy dress caught the glow of the chandeliers, transforming in the eyes of the crowd into something more radiant than any designer gown. Her shoulders straightened, her head lifted. For the first time that night, she was not hidden, she was honored. Jonathan squeezed her hand, and in that single gesture, the story of the evening shifted. No longer about chandeliers, gowns, or etiquette, it became a story of truth, sacrifice, and love revealed, and the applause carried her forward, step by step, into the place she had always belonged. Hand in hand, Jonathan guided Elena across the ballroom floor. The applause followed them like a rising tide, filling the hall with thunder that shook the chandeliers. Guests parted to make room, their eyes wide with awe. Some smiled through tears, others bowed their heads in respect. Elena's steps were hesitant at first, her heels clicking softly against the wood, but Jonathan's steady grip gave her courage. With each step, the shame she had carried all night slipped away. By the time they reached the front, her shoulders were squared, her head lifted. At the head table, Clara stood, her eyes glistening. She moved aside as Jonathan guided Elena into the seat beside them, the very place she should have occupied all along. For a moment, Elena froze, overwhelmed. But Jonathan pulled out the chair with the dignity of a son honoring a mother, and she lowered herself into it. The room erupted in fresh applause. The sound was no longer polite or restrained, it was fierce, joyful, and cleansing. Elena's simple navy dress seemed to glow beneath the chandeliers, no less radiant than the satin and lace that surrounded her. Margaret sat stiffly, her smile gone, her hands gripping her glass so tightly it might shatter. But no one was watching her anymore. The story had moved beyond her reach. Elena placed her hand gently over Jonathan's, whispering, "Thank you." He leaned close and answered, loud enough for those nearest to hear, "No, thank you for everything." And as they sat together at the head table, the meaning of the night changed forever. It was no longer just a wedding. It was a reckoning, a tribute, and a long overdue moment of truth. As Elena took her place at the head table, the applause swelled again, louder and fuller than before. It began with a few guests rising to their feet, then spread like a wave until the entire ballroom was standing. Men in tuxedos and women in sequined gowns clapped with genuine emotion, their faces softened by respect. Some guests even whistled, others wiped at their eyes with napkins. The energy in the room had shifted completely. No longer was it a carefully staged display of wealth and etiquette. It had become something raw, real, and unforgettable. Elena's eyes shimmered as she looked around, overwhelmed by the sight. For so long she had carried herself quietly, accepting invisibility as her role. Now hundreds of strangers were applauding her, honoring her sacrifices in a way she never expected. Clara, standing beside Jonathan, felt tears roll freely down her cheeks. She tried to smile through them, her chest aching with guilt and relief all at once. For the first time that evening she didn't care about appearances. She only cared that her mother was finally where she belonged. Jonathan remained by Elena's side, his hand steady on her shoulder. He bowed his head briefly, humbled by the crowd's reaction. At the far end of the table, Margaret stayed seated, her face rigid. She lifted her glass, but no one noticed. The applause drowned her out, rendering her powerless. The chandeliers sparkled overhead, reflecting the glow of a truth that no one could ignore. The ballroom wasn't celebrating flowers, gowns, or chandeliers anymore. It was celebrating Elena Morales, the mother who had been hidden and who now stood in the light. Clara stood frozen beside her chair, her hands trembling as the ballroom erupted in applause for her mother. Tears blurred her vision, the glittering chandeliers melting into streaks of light. She lifted her hands to her face, but there was no hiding it. The entire room could see her breaking. Her mind reeled back through the years. The late nights when Elena stayed awake at the sewing machine, the warm meals that always appeared on the table even when money was scarce, the way her mother clapped the loudest at every school performance. And then the recent months, her sharp words about etiquette, the cold seating arrangement, the silence she allowed to fall between them. The contrast cut her to the core. Clara looked at her mother now, sitting with dignity at the head table, her navy dress glowing under the chandeliers, her eyes swollen with tears, yet filled with pride. Shame burned in Clara's chest. This was the moment she had secretly feared, that the truth of her neglect would rise in public view. She reached for Jonathan's arm, her voice cracking. "I should have honored her from the beginning," she whispered. "She gave me everything, and I pushed her away." Jonathan nodded softly, his hand steady over hers. "Then honor her now." Clara turned to Elena, her own tears flowing freely. For the first time that evening, she let go of the facade of perfection. She no longer cared about the whispers, the photos, or the judgment of her in-laws. All she cared about was the mother she had nearly lost to her own pride. And as the applause continued, Clara lowered her head in a deep, trembling bow toward Eleanor, silently begging forgiveness. Margaret sat rigid at the end of the head table, her wineglass trembling slightly in her hand. She opened her mouth once, twice, as if to speak, perhaps to redirect the attention, perhaps to remind everyone of decorum. But no words came. The thunder of applause swallowed her voice before it even left her lips. All around her, guests were on their feet, clapping, cheering, some even dabbing at their eyes. The tide of emotion was too strong, too undeniable. Margaret's practiced smile faltered. For years, she had moved through Dallas society with ease, her words shaping conversations, her presence commanding respect. Tonight, though, she was powerless. Every glance, every heart in that room had turned toward Eleanor. She shifted uncomfortably, her pearls gleaming under the chandeliers. Beside her, relatives who usually nodded along with her remarks were now clapping enthusiastically, ignoring her stiff posture. Even the orchestra members had set down their instruments, their hands joining in applause. For Margaret, the humiliation was sharp. This was supposed to be her triumph, her son's perfect wedding, her family's shining moment. Instead, the narrative had slipped away, rewritten in real time by truth and gratitude. She pressed her lips together, forcing herself into silence. Any protest now would only deepen her defeat. Across the table, Elena sat tall, tears shining on her cheeks, her hand still clasped by Jonathan's. The sight made Margaret's jaw tighten. But there was nothing she could do. The power she once held over the evening had dissolved. The room no longer listened to her. It listened only to the story that had finally been given its rightful voice. Flashes lit the ballroom as the wedding photographer, quick to sense history unfolding, moved closer to the head table. He had spent the evening capturing the expected: bouquets, centerpieces, the glow of chandeliers. But now his lens turned to what truly mattered. Through the viewfinder, he saw Elena seated between Clara and Jonathan, her hand clasped firmly in Jonathan's, her face radiant with tears. Her navy dress, plain compared to the glittering gowns around her, gleamed like silk beneath the chandeliers. It was not fashion that made her shine, it was truth. He clicked rapidly, freezing the moment from every angle. One shot caught Clara leaning toward her mother, her eyes wet and full of regret. Another framed Jonathan standing tall, his arm protectively at Elena's shoulder. And in the background, the entire ballroom clapping, faces softened with admiration. For once, Elena was not hidden at the edge of the frame. She was the frame, the center, the story. As the camera flashed again, Elena lifted her chin, her lips curving into a trembling smile. She had never sought recognition, never imagined her life's sacrifices would be honored under crystal chandeliers. But in that instant, with every eye on her and every photo capturing her strength, She felt something she had been denied for years: dignity restored. Later, when these photos were printed and shared, they would not just show a wedding, they would show justice. They would show a mother who had been pushed to the shadows, finally illuminated. And deep in Elena's heart, she knew the truth had been preserved, not just in memory, but in images that would outlive the night. The orchestra struck a gentle note, filling the air with a warmth that seemed to match the mood of the room. Guests slowly returned to their seats, though many kept their eyes on Elena, still glowing beneath the chandeliers. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, but the usual chatter of business and social circles had vanished. People spoke of sacrifice, of love, of the woman who had been hidden and was now honored. Later that night, as limousines lined up outside and the ballroom began to empty, whispers spread across Dallas. At country clubs, offices, and Sunday church pews, the story of the wedding was retold. Not the cost of the flowers, not the grandeur of the hotel, not the elegance of the reeds. The story people carried with them was of a mother who arrived in a taxi, sat quietly by the kitchen doors, and ended the night at the head table, hand in hand with the groom. For Eleanor, it was not wealth or status that brought her there. It was the undeniable truth of a lifetime of sacrifice. For Clara, it was a lesson carved into her heart. Perfection means nothing without gratitude. And for Jonathan, it was the moment he stepped fully into honor, choosing truth over appearances. Dallas spoke of many things the next morning, but no one forgot the sight of Elena Morales rising from the shadows into the light. And from that night forward, she would never again be invisible.